So, now that we've covered the Senate division and we've covered the Gracchi, we're now going to talk about one of the first actual civil wars. And so let's talk a little bit about some of the background and some of the people that are involved in this civil war. The first person is Gaius Marius, pictured right here in this statue. Gaius Marius lived from 157 BCE to 86 BCE. He was a Roman military officer and eventually was appointed to be the rank of general, or the equivalent of general. And he was the general in charge of the military that went down to North Africa from, of course, Italy being down. Okay, so he goes down to North Africa near Carthage, okay, near the city of Carthage, and he fights against the Kingdom of Numidia, which are a North African group of people there, and they are led by their king, King Jugurtha. And he is able to defeat Jugurtha's army and defeat the Kingdom of Numidia. He doesn't completely conquer it, but he defeats them, okay? And he conquers some of it. And because of this, he becomes a military hero and a war hero. He eventually decides, when he goes back to Rome and kind of retires from the military, he decides that he wants to kind of become consul. And people kind of push him to wanting to be consul. And so he runs for consul, and he wins election because of the support of the plebeians, the plebs. The regular people vote for him. And he is the first ever army leader that started as only an army leader to eventually become consul, okay? Many other consuls became army leaders, okay? They had maybe served in the military a little bit, but they weren't ever like dedicated army career officers. And they kind of eventually went into the army after becoming consul. He did it the opposite way, where he started in the army and did very well as an army leader and then became a consul. Okay, so that's what the difference is there. And he wins again because he has support of the plebs, the plebeians, the regular people. He was elected first in 107 BCE, and then he went off and was governor for a little province for a little while. Don't worry about that. And then he comes back after 3 years and he decides to run for consulship again. And he wins again in 104. And then the following year, he runs in 103, and he wins. And he runs again in 102, and he wins. And he runs again in 101, and wins. And then he runs again finally in 100, and wins. So he's consul for multiple times. It's very interesting that he wins so many different times in consecutive years. There would be sometimes other people that did this, but he is one of the most famous ones for this. That it's year after year after year of being consul. Sometimes they end up kind of letting like someone else do it for a year. But while he's a consul, okay, over not just in 107, but all the way through 104 to 100, he's got a lot of time to be able to make some reforms and changes in things. And one of the changes he decides to make is to make changes to the army, because that's what he knows. And he realizes that some changes have been needing to happen in the army for a while. And so one of the things he decides is he wants to allow the poor into the army, because he realizes that constantly people are becoming so poor, and because that urban poor issue and all the farmer poor issue that the Gracchi both tried to fix still hasn't been fixed, okay? 20-something, 30-something years later. Still hasn't been fixed. The problem is just escalating. And kind of being kicked down the can by doing a little bit more food to the poor kind of thing. But the big issue is many of those poor people are eventually falling into debt and becoming slaves because they can't get a job doing anything. Well, he realizes one of the kind of ways to stop that is allow the poor into the army. And to do that, he has to abolish the property requirement. Remember I said that you had to have own land to be able to join the army? Well, he gets rid of that by being consul. He is able to pass laws, and the Senate agree to it, because he kind of makes the point that, hey, this is going to increase our armies down the line. And they're like, yeah, this is a good idea. But to make it the army kind of a job that people are going to want to have, okay, there needs to be some kind of way to work that out. And so there's going to be some changes on that too. But what ends up happening is we end up having that filling the need of more soldiers being needed. We've got the property requirement being abolished. And so now the poor people can become soldiers, and the armies of Rome are able to conquer more territory. Well, he decides to make the Roman legionnaire, the name for the soldier, okay, the regular soldier is called a legionnaire, into a career. Beforehand, you couldn't really make it a career in the army, unless you were a military officer. If you wanted to just be a regular soldier, and you didn't get high enough scores and stuff, and do well enough, you couldn't really make it being an officer, especially if you didn't have money kind of going in the first place. And so you would only serve for a few years as a soldier, because you couldn't even really make it a full career. But he realizes how we can get a lot of the poor people to join the military, other than just abolishing the property requirement, is make it a real career. And make it so that people are paid throughout time, as well as being given a pension after they retire. So retirement benefits, and we're going to talk about that again in a minute. He also makes it so that the Republic pays for the equipment for the soldier. Beforehand, the Republic paid for a little bit, and then you kind of paid the rest to make sure. And so that wasn't very lucrative either. But now the soldiers are going to have all of their equipment and armor and weapons paid for by the government itself, the Republic. And the last part is the retirement benefits. The retirement benefits, he decides, are not just going to be a little bit of money, but he realizes that they need to be able to be given some land, that these soldiers can be given land. And the best way to give them land is give them land usually in areas that were conquered by the Romans, somewhere that they conquer off in the distance, and that if we end up settling those Roman soldiers in that area, kind of as the border, right near the border area, then if an enemy army were to come near that border area, there's a bunch of retired soldiers that are more than willing to fight for their land and to protect Rome before maybe a real army can show up. And so this is a really good idea at the time, and so it works. One of the other ideas about the retirement benefits, though, is that the generals in charge of the military armies, they're going to have to go to the Senate to make sure that the Senate actually follows through on the retirement benefits. And that's going to cause this, where the Legion loyalty shifts from the Republic to their commander, to the commanding officer that's making sure that they get their retirement benefits. Because they might be promised the retirement benefit, but until the Senate actually gets off their butt and passes a bill, they're not going to get it. The soldiers won't get it when they retire. And so what ends up having to happen is constantly the military commanders have to force the issue with the Senate, say, hey, look, my guys want to retire, and they're not going to retire until you give them land, and if you kick it down the can a little bit further, they're going to stay in the military, and they're either going to rebel, or they're going to demand even more land. And so the Senate would typically go, okay, we'll get to giving them land now, so we don't have to give them even more a couple years later. And so you end up having these soldiers stay in sometimes 10, 20 years, sometimes less, and it depends on how much they serve or how long of a serving time that they do in the army for how much land they get. And so the Senate, it's really beneficial to them if they end up kind of retiring people out quick, but not necessarily always happens. The soldiers are now going to be constantly training. As opposed to just in time for a war, they're going to constantly train all year round. They're going to march with their supplies. They would have sometimes march 20 miles a day with all of their supplies. Not only their armor, which is now changed, as you can see, they've got different armor and different shields and stuff. All of their soldiers are going to be eventually uniformed like this soon, and it's going to be paid for by the government. But they're also going to be carrying their backpack with their food. Sometimes maybe they'll have that on the cart or something like that, or a wagon, but they're typically going to have their tent, their sleeping bag, all sorts of things with them. They also are going to be given a new weapon called the pilum, okay, the pilum. And it is this weapon right here. You can't really see it because it's hidden by the shield. It's a big spear with a big ball kind of joint here, which made of wood. And then there's the metal part here where the spear part is right here. And so the spear point at the top. These were throwing weapons, like a javelin or a throwing spear. And what was really cool about these is that they could throw the pilum at the enemy, and that this part right here was very brittle and made so that the metal connecting part with the wood right here, with the ball joint here, would break if it ended up hitting something. And so that you end up throwing this pilum, and if it hits an enemy soldier, then it might go through them and kill them. And that means that if the enemy wants to take it out, they have to take it out their dead buddy. But if they're trying to do that, the little ball joint might break because they're trying to pull it out of another person. If it just gets stuck in the ground or on hits a rock or a tree or something, it's going to break or bend even. And so this new weapon was very useful because it couldn't be thrown back at the soldiers. It was a very interesting new weapon. They also had military forms on how the legion was structured. He changed it from 5,000 to 5,280 soldiers per legion, slightly more. Each legion was divided into different groups as opposed to the old maniple system. It was now 10 cohorts, okay? Cohort or 10 cohorts if you want to do plural. Each of these cohorts was 480 men for 9 of them, and were the regular soldiers. And the most veteran soldiers, the elite soldiers, were formed up into a double-sized cohort of 960 men. Each cohort was then divided up into its own groups, okay, called a century, which a century, today is 100. Well, back then it was only 80, okay? That was how the Romans counted their centuries, was 80 men, not 100. Don't worry about that. But centuries for that. And so it would be 6 centuries would be one of those, or 12 centuries for this one, okay? And then there would also be the cavalry, the horsemen on the side, extra. And so he made these major reforms. And these soldiers are all going to be working together and having this command hierarchy where the 80 men would listen to their leader here, and then those guys would listen to their leaders in one of the cohort commanders, and then the cohort commanders would then talk to the legion general, okay? And so we end up having that. And it works out a lot better than the old maniple system. Moving on, we have another man that comes to being a cause for the Civil War, is Lucius Cornelius Sulla. He lived from 138 BCE to 78 BCE, so roughly around the same time that Gaius Marius was living. He was born about 20 years later than Marius, so he's 20 years younger than Marius. And he is a military commander, but he's also a patrician member of the Optimates. Marius loved the plebeians. He was basically a populares. But Sulla is a member of the Optimates. He's a military commander under Marius and works with Marius very well for a long time. And he actually takes place in this war that there's kind of a bit of a war in the year 91 to 88 BCE, a kind of civil war called the Social War, which is a conflict between Rome and the various tribes in Italy, okay, throughout the Italian peninsula, all wanting citizenship. All these different tribes in Rome that we talked about several lectures ago, they've never been given Latin rights or citizenship. They're just still free men. Just regular free men walking around and doing jobs, and only being able to do certain jobs. And because of this, they've eventually finally decided to rebel. And so you end up having this war called the Social War, which lasts from 91 to 88 BCE. And Sulla is commander during that, along with Marius. And Sulla is one of the loyal Roman leaders during the Social War that stays loyal to the Roman Republic, as well as Marius. And at the end of the war, they decide that, even though the Roman Republic and Sulla and Marius win this war in the Social War against all of these other tribes and against these free men that are revolting, they decide, we're just going to have this problem again in 5 years, or 10 years, or 20 years, when the people want rights again. So let's just give them citizenship, okay, rather than having another problem. So that was the end of that social war, or that little civil war. Well, Sulla and Marius are going to be big names in the next war. Eventually, Sulla decides that he wants to go off and fight King Mithridates, who lives all the way out in Asia Minor. So if we go back to the map, Mithridates lives in this area, present-day Turkey, okay? And Mithridates is this king that has a kingdom out there, and Sulla finds out that this king is very great and has tons of elephants to fight, and Sulla's like, that's awesome, I want to go fight these elephants, and I want to go fight against this army with my army. However, Marius also wants that job. And both of them are the top commanders of the Roman military. Marius, however, has a little bit more persuasion in the Senate because he's been consul. and he persuades the Senate successfully to give him command of that army instead. And so Marius goes off to go do that, and Sulla kind of throws a fit and starts arguing. And he ends up actually basically arguing with the Senate, and the Senate says, look, Sulla, you need to leave Rome, or we're going to arrest you if you don't leave the city peacefully and stop throwing this tantrum, basically. And so Sulla leaves the city of Rome, and he meets up with his 5 loyal veteran legions that he's been able to win in the previous war against the Social War and as well as other wars. And they were all hoping to be able to be in this Mithridatic War to get all the loot from Asia Minor. And they're being told by him, sorry, the Senate said no to us. We don't get to do that. And so they all say, well, we want to do whatever it takes to make sure we can go on that war. And Sulla tells them the only way to do that is go to Rome and attack the Senate. And so Sulla leads his army of the royal veteran legions into the city of Rome and takes over the city of Rome. And then tells the Senate, you're going to let us go over to Asia Minor now and let us go fight Mithridates. And the Senate says, well, Marius is already on his way there, but go ahead. Because we can't tell you no, or we'll die. And so Sulla leaves to go do that, and go attack Asia Minor. Well, while he's on his way, Marius gets word that Sulla has attacked Rome, and so Marius turns his armies around and comes back. And kind of restores order. Well, Sulla, at that point, kind of finds out that Marius is causing problems in Rome again, so he turns around and never goes and fights Mithridates, and then brings his army, and so now you have a showdown in Italy between Marius and his army, and Sulla and his army. Absolutely crazy. But that's what you've got. And so this is why it's called Sulla's First Civil War, which lasts from 88 to 86 BCE. And the Senate realizes, we're going to make Sulla the dictator because he kind of wins this war. And so Sulla ends up winning that war, and the Senate makes Sulla as a dictator to just kind of appease him. Moving on. Marius is gone. Marius is basically dying now, or dead now, and we've got Sulla in charge. And we end up having Sulla go back to Rome, and he's now become dictator. But a bunch of other soldiers, some of Marius's supporters, Marius is dead, decide to still fight against Sulla. And we have this battle outside the city of Rome, outside the walls of the city of Rome itself, called the Battle of Colline Gate. November 82 BCE is when it happens. November of 82 BCE. And it's Sulla versus Marius again on this second Sulla Civil War. And during the fight, some of Marius' supporters are protecting this gate. And it looks very similar to like this, where there's a portcullis, which is like that big metal gate that comes crashing down between the wall, okay? And you end up having Sulla's troops fighting near this gate. And during the battle, the Marius' supporters are winning the battle. And this other army, from nowhere, just shows up, led by a man named Marcus Licinius Crassus. Marcus Licinius Crassus is this rich patrician, and I'll talk about him later, this rich patrician that used his own money to basically hire a bunch of mercenaries to come help Sulla, because he decides that he wants to be on Sulla's side as opposed to Marius' side, even though Marius is dead. And so they end up having this battle around this gate, and at one point, several senators that are on Marius' side, or Marius' supporters' side, run through this gate, and the portcullis is closed on those senators and it actually kills those senators. It crushes them underneath it because they're fleeing away from Sulla's troops as well as Crassus's troops. Because Crassus's army shows up and helps Sulla, Sulla and Crassus are able to defeat Marius' supporters, and Marius' supporters are all killed. And Sulla, again, basically goes to the Senate and says, hey, you're going to make me dictator again, right? And they say yes. And he's like, and you're going to do it for life. You're going to make me not a 6-month time, but you're going to make me dictator for the rest of my life. And the Senate that's left are all basically like, yes, we're going to do that, because otherwise we'll die. And so we end up having the Second Civil War is now over, and Sulla is dictator again. During this time, he decides to curtail the power of the plebeian tribune. He also writes up something called the prescription lists, where the prescription lists are these lists of anyone that supported Marius in the previous civil war, in this civil war, or the previous one, as well as any senators, any tribunes, plebeian tribunes, anyone that does not fully support Sulla is put on this list. And it's basically this hit list, meaning that this list is going to be put up in the middle of the Roman marketplace, okay, in the middle of the town square. Anyone can go and look at the list, and if a person's name is on the list, anybody can go and kill that person on the list. And if you prove that you killed that person on that list, you get everything that person owned. Well, what ends up happening during this time is, if you have an enemy and you like their stuff, you can just write their name on the list. What's to say that Sulla didn't do it? As long as you get the handwriting close, right? And so you end up having that constantly happen. And it absolutely is a terrifying time in Rome, where people are just being put on the lists and killed because people want their stuff and want their money. And Sulla is basically putting anyone he doesn't like on that list. Marcus Licinius Crassus is also benefiting from this as well. Okay, he is putting people that he doesn't like on that list because he's on Sulla's side. Eventually, Sulla gets tired of being dictator after a few years, like 2, in 79 BCE, or 780 BCE, sorry, and he gives up his power of dictatorship, and he decides to have a fair election, or he calls it a fair election, and he wins the consulship in that election, and then finally after that consulship of 1 year, he fully retires. He could have been dictator for the rest of his life. He wanted to actually see if the people still liked him or not once he got rid of all of his enemies. He wins this election, stays as consul for a year, and retires in 79 BCE after that year. From 80 to 79 is when he was consul. And after that, he retires. And goes out, buys a place, buys one of those big patrician farms out in the middle of the countryside, and is never heard from again. He dies in retirement. However, the people back in Rome, such as Marcus Licinius Crassus and the remaining Senate members, most of them are optimates, because the populares were the ones that were Marius supporters. So many of the political party that was against the optimates are dead. They were put on those prescription lists. And that's why people didn't necessarily always tell you who they were, on the side of. And so now the optimates are in control, and it's kind of less of a republic. And so the next few years are going to be less of a republic, and so we will talk about what happens after this in the next video.